I wanted to talk about the San Antonio Spurs a little bit because I feel like they are one of the NBA's wild cards heading into the season, and I thought their offseason was interesting. Not going to sit here and say that I thought they had an elite offseason, but I would categorize it as an offseason where they did really good business when it comes to building around your future superstar franchise player in Victor Wembenyama. So that begs the question for me, and it's going to sound crazy. Well, I don't know how crazy if you're as high as I am and a lot of others are on Victor Wembanyama. Might depend on how you feel about the Spurs, but even though the West is so tough, I just think the Spurs are going to make the playoffs next year. Now, I wanted to go bold and put the Spurs in the top 6, but the West is just too deep. It's hard to find teams that could have a slide back. You know, there's one or two teams in there, like I could very easily see the Clippers just having a season from hell where everything just goes wrong, Kawhi's hurt again and all that stuff, and I could very easily see them sliding back. But that's one team out of 10 teams last year that won 46 games. I'm not going to sit here and say that, you know, the top 3 in the West, that's my top 3 in the West, you know, the Nuggets, Thunder, and the Timberwolves, and the Dallas Mavericks, of course, the top 4. But you start going through it, the West is just too deep. But I very strongly believe that the Spurs not only have a chance to be a top 6 team in the West just in terms of seeding, but I think they very easily make the play-in. And the reason is simple. Victor Wembanyama is going to be a top 10 to 7 player next year or this upcoming year. And I just think with players like this that are clearly transcendent talents, the leap just happens when you least expect it. And they're already here, like they've arrived. And Wembanyama, even though, you know, he started off the year playing the 4, and they finally moved him to the center, he was absolutely dominant as a rookie. Just some numbers for me that really just point me in the direction of this team is making the playoffs next year is the fact that the first 19 games of the season, the Spurs had him at the 4, starting next to Zach Collins, and, you know, was still very effective defensively, but was making rookie mistakes defensively and all that stuff. Still averaged 19, nearly 10, and nearly 3 blocks a game. But after that road game against the Minnesota Timberwolves, they ripped the Band-Aid off. They put Wembanyama at the 5. And man, next year it's going to be scary for the rest of the NBA. So in the 52 games that Victor Wembanyama started at center, his numbers jumped up, his efficiency jumped up, his offensive responsibilities also jumped up, and a minutes restriction, by the way, because he hurt his ankle, had a few other tweaks, and the Spurs had him on a minutes restriction. So he actually played 29.5 minutes per game while starting at the center throughout 52 games, which is about a minute less or half a minute less per game than the first 19 games of the season where he was playing the 4. And he still put up 23 a game, nearly 4 blocks a game, 4.5 assists, 11 rebounds, and his 3-point shot came around and shot 34.5%, but took 6 attempts per game. I'm just excited with this offseason he's having. He looks good in the Olympics. He looks stronger. I just cannot wait to see what this leap from Victor next year looks like, presumably without a minutes restriction. And I think the Spurs kind of planned for this too. Now, the Spurs can go about this with their regular season approach in a lot of different ways. I really want to see how they, you know, look the first 30 games, because that could easily determine if the Spurs just want to be back in the lottery. But I think with the offseason they had, it shows anything but. They realize if we just put competent players around a talent like Victor Wembanyama and Devin Vassell, who has a nice 2-man game with Wembanyama and fits with the offseason signings the Spurs have had, this team with competent NBA players and Victor Wembanyama possibly making a leap to first-team All-NBA, which I'm telling you, it's not impossible. And then the Spurs add Chris Paul. They get Harrison Barnes for free. And I know, look, watching him in Sacramento this past year, Harrison Barnes was just not good. But that's another adult in the room, another vet in the locker room, somebody who is not a good defensive player, but at least he has versatility. You can play him at small ball 4. He's big enough to, you know, handle being on the block defensively. you could easily do worse than Harrison Barnes if you're, at the stage of the rebuild that the Spurs are at. Chris Paul, even at this stage in his career, is flat out a winning player, and teams always play better when he is on the floor. And, there was a lot of hemming and hawing about the Jeremy Sohan point guard experiment last year and wanting to start Tre Jones, even though I think Tre Jones is a little overextended when he starts, but he is still a very good point guard. Getting Chris Paul and moving Tre Jones back to a backup role, that's just going to benefit greatly for the Spurs, and Chris Paul is just the ultimate facilitator. He's going to teach Wembanyama all the tricks of the trade when it comes to the pick and roll and the pick and pop, and I'm sure he's going to love Wembanyama's competitive toughness. I mean, just look at the young guys Chris Paul has always had an effect on. So that's just a great low risk, high reward signing. No risk, really. It was just a 1 year, $11 million deal. And for the stage of the rebuild the Spurs are in, I would easily make that move. Fills in the starting one. And then Devin Vassell fits well off of Chris Paul because Chris Paul will easily find Vassell in the shooting pocket with catch and shoot threes. Vassell can also, attack a closeout, especially when you get him moving off ball. I just like this fit all around for the Spurs. Now, defensively, obviously, Chris Paul is not the same, but he's still a smart defender, still has steel trap hands. And then, you have some switchability and some versatility with Harrison Barnes and Jeremy Sohan at the 3. That's my projected starting 5 at least, is CP3, Vassell, Harrison Barnes, Sohan, and Wemby. And I was one of the very few on the island that was okay with the Jeremy Sohan point guard experiment. Not because I thought it was a long-term thing that the Spurs could work on, but because you want to fast-track someone like Jeremy Sohan's development. I've described him on this channel multiple times as someone that's multiple clay, and I think him playing point guard at least rounds out some of his playmaking chops that would translate for him once he goes back to the 4. But I thought it was much needed reps for Jeremy Sohan. And I just think because of the defensive versatility and the balance between the scoring of Wembanyama and Vassell and Chris Paul setting the table, I think Sohan should be starting at the 4 instead of Keldon Johnson. Keldon Johnson came off the bench after, starting 27 games. And so I think Johnson's probably still going to come off the bench. You have Tre Jones. If you just look at the first 9 players in the rotation for the Spurs, they have playable NBA players, and they have a rising megastar in Victor Wembenyama. And I think all these players fit around Wembanyama. They're competent NBA players. Getting Chris Paul and Harrison Barnes as adults in the room kind of rounds out the rotation a little bit. And I am very bullish on this Spurs team and what they did in the offseason. I mean, if you think about it, a 22-win Spurs team last year, with Victor Wembanyama and Devin Vassell on the floor, had a near +2 net rating with nearly 2,600 possessions on a 22-win team with Wembanyama on a minutes restriction. And then if you want to expand it out to the trio of Tre Jones, Devin Vassell, and Victor Wembanyama, a +10.2 net rating with over 1,700 possessions. Elite defense, 105.7 defensive rating. Offensive rating could be a little bit better, but still really good at 115.9. Just imagine putting Chris Paul in there instead of Tre Jones. And Tre Jones is a very good point guard, which is why I think the point's being undersold that having Tre Jones moving back to the bench is actually going to benefit the Spurs. They're going to have a floor general on the floor at all times. I just like the moves the Spurs have made with Wembanyama. Now, I really wanted to go bold with the hot take, but I really don't want to go bold with the hot take if I don't have, a pathway for the take to be right. So I don't think the Spurs are going to make a top 6 seed in the West, but I would absolutely make it a lock, for me at least, that they're going to make the playoffs. But with talents like Wembanyama, usually by the 2nd or 3rd year, that player's team is usually in the mid-40s, high 50s, just in terms of win total. And I'm just saying I wouldn't be surprised to see the Spurs, exceed expectations and win like it's not. To me, there is a universe where the Spurs could win 45-plus games because Wembanyama takes that leap to being a top 10 player, because Chris Paul and Harrison Barnes are the veterans in the starting lineup that the Spurs need to facilitate Wembanyama's growth. They already have, Devin Vassell, who was the 2nd best offensive player on the team. And then you move some of your key starters back to the bench in a more comfortable role. Julian Champagnie, another, 6'8", 36% three-point shooter. Really came on in that 2022-23 season towards the end, like in the final 15 games with the Spurs, and then just started getting consistent minutes this past season in the 23-24 season. And it's just somebody that's 6'8", can shoot threes. That's just a nice archetype for a role player to have around this type of team. And that's not taking into account that maybe Stephon Castle kind of pops a little bit more than people expect this upcoming season. You still have, microwave scoring options like Malachi Branham. I don't know. I'm just really bullish on the Spurs team. I've liked the offseason that they've had. It's low-key. It's good business, fitting around your franchise player. And I don't know. I'm just really bullish on this team because I would not bet against someone like Wembanyama, 1, not making the leap, 2, misjudging the size of the leap we could see from him. Because transcendent players like that take bigger leaps than what people usually expect. And I'm not going to bet against that.